this computer. And we are recording. Once again, this is Tara Goldstein. Welcome to New Research at Noon. Today, we're going to look at research on institutions, international aid, and policing. And we have Nisha Toomey here and Elaine Cagulada. So let's begin with Elaine. Let us hear a little bit about what program you're teaching here at New College and what courses you're TAing this year.
Sure. Thanks so much, Tara. And also just thank you to everyone who is attending today and taking part in this conversation. Feeling very happy to be here. So this year I am TAing NEW or New 241, Introduction to Critical Disability Studies. I can see a few of my students actually attending, which is really great. Nice to see you all here. And the course instructor is Tanya Ruiz Chapman, a fellow PhD candidate actually in OISE's Department of Social Justice Education. And yeah, I'm just feeling super lucky to be learning from her and with the students in that course. Did I answer?
That's perfect. Just before I ask Elaine the same questions, can you tell me, ask Nisha the same questions. Can you tell me if there's been a special moment that's happened as the group has begun to work together online?
Yeah, we had a really nice kind of moment at the beginning, and there's been many moments already, and it's only week 3, so that's exciting. I know. But yeah, so, with online, I was a little nervous how we were going to get started, but we began with introductions, and I really just invited students to tell me a little bit about where they're coming from, why they were interested in a critical disability studies course. And it was just really neat to hear about everyone's desire to know disability differently and to know what fields people are coming from. So I had students in human geography and criminology and critical equity studies and sociology, and just to know that we would all learn together and coming from different places. So that was a really special moment.
Fantastic. And Nisha, I know that you probably haven't begun to teach, right? Your courses next semester. What are you going to be TAing? We need you to unmute.
Thanks.
No problem.
Yeah, so I'll be TAing the Community Disengagement and Solidarity course with Professor Stanley Doyle-Wood. And I was at New College TAing with the Community Engaged Learning and Community Engaged Research programs for a few years. And New College is just a really special place inside the University of Toronto. So it's been so wonderful to be involved in different courses there throughout the years.
Great. Since your course is going to be next semester, tell us a little bit about that course in case some of the students here have not made their final decisions. What might be lovely about taking your course?
Well, I'm just learning about it myself, actually. I believe it's a new-ish course taught by Dr. Doyle-Wood, and I know that I will say that I know that he ran an equity studies course that was very much loved and has had a lot of impact on a lot of important activists around Toronto. So I'm sure that it's going to ask really important questions about working within community organizations and questions around solidarity, which are really prescient right now, around like, what does it mean to be in what we call solidarity, right? And what does it mean to be an ally right now when in a really challenging and changing moment?
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we know that in community engaged research is a field all on its own. And I'm sure that courses like the one that you're going to be teaching will give us an opportunity to think about what does it mean to do good, deep research that's respectful with communities. Excellent. Okay, so back to Elaine now. Elaine, what university are you doing your doctoral at? What program are you doing your doctorate in? And how did you choose that university, that program?
Sure. So I'm doing my doctoral research here at University of Toronto in the Department of Social Justice Education at OISE. Why did I choose this department? I think I'll get to that a little more. I'll delve into it definitely a bit more as well. But, in Angela Davis in her foreword to Patrice Khan-Coulour's and Asha Bandali's book, When They Call You a Terrorist, says something that really resonates with me about Patrice's story, which is that her story is at the intersection of personal experience and political resistance. And that's really, I think, also where I'm coming from. There's personal experiences and political resistance kind of melded together in my pursuit of trying to understand the institution of police and disability and deafness and race. And so when I was looking for doctoral programs that kind of look at disability studies differently, or disability differently, I should say, I came across Tanya Tichkowski's research and was, I was really excited, and I felt awakened in a way, and I just overwhelmed with the possibility of imagining disability in the ways that she was inviting us to do so in her work, or that she invites us to do so in her work. So she is situated in SJE, and she is my supervisor. So it was very much, I looked up, someone that's doing work in a way that interests me, and I found her and I applied. So yeah, it says kind of, yeah, just like that.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask Nisha the same question in a moment, but for folks who don't know what the acronym OISE means, it's the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. It's part of the University of Toronto. It's the Faculty of Education. It's where folks become teachers through the Masters of Teaching program, and where folks who are interested in advanced higher education, masters and doctorates, do educational research. So thanks for that, Elaine. Nisha, now to you. We're going to ask you, what university are you at? What program are you at? And how did you come to study at that place and in that program?
Yeah, so I'm also at Social Justice Education, studying under Dr. Eve Tuck. I consider myself a bit of a latecomer to the PhD. I was working in the NGO field and in nonprofits for a number of years, between my BA and my master's, and then after my master's. And I just was working for an NGO that's based in India, but I was on the Ottawa side for a couple of years, and just kind of wanting to move my thought process forward around what was going on in the international or organizational field. So in these fields that are charity and aid, I just wanted to go somewhere where I could write about and think about them in like a more clear way. And social justice education, I've always been in the field of education, and so it just resonated with me as a program.
So would you say, Nisha, that your everyday experiences working abroad and perhaps even in international aid gave you some reasons to ask questions? And did the doctoral study come as a result of that?
Yeah, so my story is that after I finished my BA, I wanted to, I was like many young people, I wanted to go out in the world and make change and do something different. I'm half Indian, and I'd never had a chance to travel overseas and also to go to Asia. So I kind of took the first opportunity that came up. I literally saw a poster on a wall, and I went to Myanmar, on the Thailand-Myanmar border, and I worked there for 6 months. And I also think that's important to note, because right now I'm writing kind of against the voluntourism industry. And I always tell young people, don't go and work somewhere for 2 weeks, and don't go work somewhere for 3 months. You've got to go minimum 6 months and even longer. And I ended up going back for 5 years and working in that part of the world. And so when I was there, I experienced a whole array of organizational work, and understood that what was going on at the grassroots level among actual communities and people was kind of different from what was happening at the international agency level. And there was a real dissonance in terms of how NGOs were working with local communities. And there were also a lot of successes when NGOs actually listened to local communities. And so it's been inspiring my thought process ever since, and I just wanted to do more work around it.
So after hearing you speak about that connection, I think community engaged learning is going to be a great course for you, because already I could see how much you have to offer. Elaine, a similar question. Was there a particular set of events or a particular set of experiences that pushed you to your doctoral research?
Yeah, I have family who are disabled and deaf, and I was studying actually, so also coming from education, just like Nisha, and I worked in schools as well, taught grade 6 for a while, which was really fun. And that was kind of, there were my experiences there with some of how disabled children were expected to be treated. I come from Alberta, like that's where I was teaching. And, the kind of plans that we were expected to fill out, made me really question how we perceive disability. And, fast forward to my MA, which I pursued and completed at Ryerson in early childhood studies, my thesis, it was about, deaf and hard of hearing children and how parents perceive their deaf and hard of hearing children and their social and emotional well-being. So that was kind of, all of these things kind of through line led me then to my doctoral research. But really the big moment, kind of, I would say almost like the rupturing that really brought me to the very specific topic that I'm currently working with and exploring was, near the end of my MA, I wasn't thinking about pursuing doctoral research. I thought, just like Nisha after her BA, I was like, I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna go back to schools and teach, and with a renewed understanding of, of education. And but so yeah, at the end of my MA, my one of a like a dear family member of mine, deaf, disabled, racialized, was incarcerated. And the events leading up to that were so difficult for all of us, and especially of course for him. And so that really made me question disability, but also disability and race in relation to policing.
So what we're really seeing in what you're both going to share in terms of your projects today is research as activism. What we have are folks who are deeply engaged in the work of equity, through their community engagement, in Nisha's case, through schooling, in Elaine's case, and that everyday experience, your everyday activism, your everyday engagement with communities and families allowed you to see that there was a problem out there, a problem that could really benefit from deep study, deep reading, and that would have implications for others who need to think similarly, think deeply similarly. So I think we are beginning to see a theme of research as activism, which is incredibly exciting. So we're going to move now to a set of questions about the particular thesis projects that that Elaine and Nisha are going to talk to us about, that they are doing right now. But I wanted to say welcome to those who I haven't said welcome to you. It's great to have you here. And I have several colleagues who have joined us. Thank you so much for making time, for being here. Everybody is working very, very hard. And to have you join Nisha, Elaine, and us, that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so Nisha, would we begin with you? The title that I've given to your thesis project, it's not your own title, but one that I thought would be good for folks who are going to be introduced to your work, is called Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, International Aid, and Humanitarianism. So could you just tell us a little bit about what's the project about and why you wanted to study your topic? You did a little bit of that work already, but how did you narrow it down?
Yeah, so my topic really, as I noted a little bit, it does start in the context of the Thailand-Myanmar border. And what I noticed there was that there was a large amount of NGOs tackling the issue of displacement because there's a huge number of refugees and migrant workers living along the border due to civil war inside of Myanmar, but also land confiscation. And it's been an escalating problem of losing lands for people, particularly in Karen state, which is what Thailand borders on. So Karen peoples are an indigenous group inside of Myanmar. They number about 7 million people. They are a sovereign nation, so they'll call themselves a sovereign nation. That's why they've been engaged in civil war for a long time. And what's happening in that part of the world is that you have what's called special economic zones, so places where the laws are liberalized around trade and free trade, and multinational corporations will come in and have interests in taking up as much land as possible from people in order to do business and extract from the natural environment. So you have these really lush, diverse ecosystems that Karen people have been stewarding for thousands of years, getting basically decimated by multinational corporations coming out of different countries around the world. But in that part of the world, it's really China and Thailand, both of the Koreas. And so I became interested in this question of, if there is this huge number of NGOs with millions and millions of dollars going into aid in this region for people who are being displaced, what are they doing about the issue of land confiscation? And so my wider research looks at how NGOs around the world globally, whether they're actually talking about the word land and thinking about the problem of land confiscation. And so learning under Indigenous scholarship in Canada, and on Turtle Island, so across the states in Canada, we know that Indigenous peoples are engaged in work around stopping settlers from coming onto their lands and taking more of their lands. And we also learned from Indigenous theory that one of the things about settler colonialism is that settlers want land, they want to acquire land, but they don't want to say the word land. They don't want to talk about land. It's always under the radar that land is being stolen from people. So my work is looking at, why aren't NGOs tackling this issue? Because they're really not. And we're in right now what social scientists call the global land rush. So we have an unprecedented moves towards taking as much land as possible from people all over the world by multinational corporations. A lot of it's for speculative for investing by like foreign firms and banks. And that started after the crash in 2008. And so in this context, and of course, whose lands are getting taken? Well, local people, local communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities. That's whose lands are being taken from them. And so, yeah, so my research is around whether NGOs actually talk about this, and of course, tracing the history of settler colonialism as a logic in international organizational work in terms of the aid sector and humanitarian work, and looking at how, if you're based in a settler colonial logic and a capitalist logic, how are you ever going to fix the problems that are actually being caused by settler colonialism and capitalism?
Brilliant. I'm going to, Elaine, if it's okay, I'm going to ask Nisha one more question to give people a chance to think of questions to ask Nisha about her project, and then we'll move on to your project. So we're going to have time for a few questions just about the things that Nisha has talked about right now, the outline of her project. I can see it's really close under your skin because you were able to tell the story of your project so beautifully. So thank you for that. I'm going to let folks think about questions. We can take questions if you raise your hand, or if you just want to wave at me, or if you feel more comfortable in the chat box, I will look at the chat box too. But while people are thinking of questions to ask Nisha about either settler colonialism or white supremacy or international aid, and Nisha, when you read, there are a lot of writers and theorists that you read. Do you have one or two theorists that have been really, influential on how you're understanding your research problem?
That's a big one. There are many right now, since I'm thick in the dissertation writing. I'm reading a lot of Catherine McKittrick these days, who has a theory called plantation economics. So Dr. McKittrick looks at how the logics of the plantation have continued to be followed in terms of a logic in the political economies that we have today. And then I definitely read lots of my own supervisor, Dr. Eve Tuck, because there's another part of my work that is really about research ethics and doing research ethically when you go and visit communities and actually work with them, which is what I did. I went back to a community that I know really well and is very close to me, but still I find it really important to consider the question of, like, what does it mean to go and take people's time and talk about a specific context.
Great. So we're going to open it up for some questions, but when you're done and we start to move to Elaine, if in the chat box you could write down the names of those two theorists, that would be wonderful. So folks can see if they want to do similar reading. So we have some time for a few questions. You can wave at me, raise your hand, write it in the chat. Anything you want to ask Nisha? Everything is interesting to us. There is no such thing as an uninteresting question. And I know that Nisha would love to be able to hear what your interests are around her thesis. So don't be shy. Anybody want to start? I'm going to go to number 2, see if I see any hands. Yes, Casey?
Hi. I've been thinking a lot about humanitarian aid recently because I'm a global health specialist, so that's a lot of what I study. The way I've been viewing it recently is, on one spectrum, there's just straight up humanitarian violence through volunteerism and such. Perhaps more in the center, at least in my perspective, there's like where you come into capitalism, like the Bill and Miranda Gates Foundation. And on the very other end is, I think, Nisha, what you've been talking about in thinking more of humanitarian aid in the context of settler colonial violence and colonialism. I was wondering if you had thoughts on where NGOs should proceed then, and looking at aid through that context and how that might be approached.
Thank you, Casey. Great question.
Yeah, it's a hard thing because it's hard to be writing against a field that is so well-intentioned, and one would not want to sit and say that groups like MSF shouldn't be doing their work, or that groups like, this is a huge complex, right? It's an industrial complex, and you're talking about billions of dollars, and in small communities, there's a lot of places who actually rely on NGO money, right? So one of the things I like to think about is not necessarily like, where do NGOs go, but what about the grassroots communities who rely on NGO money? So one of the things that I learned from my context is, like, being subversive with NGO money is a way to do good work, So one of the projects I worked on, we had to say that we were doing English immersion in order to get a great big grant to do education. It was something that satisfied funders, and we were able to do what was actually, in effect, like a critical thinking school, and teach the things that that needed to be taught that were much more important than English, but we had to call it English immersion. And so, like, ways that grassroots organizations actually use NGO money might look very different from what NGOs do. But definitely, I think that NGOs need to have a reckoning in the same way as settler societies in general need to have a reckoning with what are the histories and what are the projects, right? And so when I say white supremacy as a project, it's still this project of thinking that whiteness is a superior way of being, and that Eurocentric knowledge systems are knowledge systems that make more sense. And when it comes to land confiscation, what we have right now today is we do still have over 50% of the world's food being produced by people who are living with the land in what's called customary land laws. So traditional ways of farming, which is like rotating crops, small agriculture, diverse crops. And it's still more than 50% of the world's food. So big agriculture has not yet taken over and has not yet confiscated land. So there's still work that I think NGOs can do in supporting people from not losing lands. So I would definitely like to see like direct work in that, but it does require a change in logic around private property, land as being something that we can own. So yeah, it's a whole thing.
Thank you so much, Nisha. Thank you very much, Casey. Let's do one more question before we give the floor to Elaine, and I'll come back with more time for questions in case you think of something later. Do we have one more question? You can raise your hand, wave at me, or write in the chat. If you check the chat box, Nisha has given us a list of some of the theorists that she's been reading that have made an impact on her research project, and you may want to follow up. One more question for Nisha. There'll be another opportunity later, but I'm just going to check number 2. Okay, we're good for now. Nisha, thank you so much so far. And we're going to come back to you after we hear from Elaine. So Elaine, this is your time now to tell us a little bit about your project. To engage a general audience, I called your project Understandings of Disability, Race, and Difference in Policing. You gave us a beautiful introduction about how you came to study at grad school and how you came to study this project. What's your project about, and how is it developing at this point?
Sure, thank you so much. So my project, I know in the session description, it's quite detailed, so I'm sure some are already familiar with how it's developing at this point. But my work really focuses on stories of deafness, disability, race, and policing that take hold of our expectations of what it means to appear, to act, and move normally. So, the overarching interest of my research is, the formation of relations between police and those policed and how these relations come to exist. I go about, also in dissertation writing right now, but I'm going about examining how these relations between police and those policed, and I should say specifically, particularly within the institution of police, because as we know, policing extends beyond the institution of police, much more beyond. And but I go about examining this relation as it's constituted by through reading and restoring videos of encounters between deaf people and police officers, as well as reading and restoring mandatory accessibility training modules for members of the Toronto Police Service. As it's probably clear, my dissertation is moved by, with, and through story. I guess I didn't explain this earlier, or I mentioned this earlier, but my background my BA was in English, and I've always been a writer and just in love with telling stories and writing stories. I didn't expect to be invited to bring this creative inclination into my PhD work, but that was something that my supervisor and mentor, Tanya Tichkovsky, really encouraged me to do, was if I love to write and tell stories, then how can I perhaps meld that or entangle that into my doctoral writing and inquiry. So that is very much part of that creative piece, is very much alive in my work. Even in my introduction right now, I begin with a very long poem and just explaining how I arrived at where I'm currently at with my project. But we talk about people that have influenced us, and of course Tanya's up there, mentor. I've read a lot of her work, but I'm also influenced very much by if these names will be helpful for students and colleagues, influenced by Thomas King, Saadia Hartman, Audre Lorde, excuse me, Sylvia Wynter, Rod McCalco, and more. I'm also very much influenced the restoring the social, my method of inquiry, that is inspired and in conversation with Dorothy Smith's writing the social, and that inquiry into our everyday, every night worlds and the coordination of our everyday and every night worlds and our activities in those worlds. And Dorothy Smith says something too that really moved me about, this objectified world in common that's vested in text, that coordinates, is the essential coordinator of our activities, our policies, our decisions, and it's produced by subjects. And so this objectified world in common, I understand it to find expression through the punitive arm of the institution of police. And that to me is very interesting. How does the institution of police then express itself? How does it express particular expectations, and how do those expectations story particular folks? So, I look into, how particular characters are then created, characters of the stranger, the deviant, the criminal, and the human, and how this character creation has implications and consequences on the everyday, every night lives of, our everyday and every night lives, right? And so that's really where I'm at with my project. It's really thinking about this method of inquiry that I'm calling the restoring the social, and yeah, trying to, of course, weave in my love and my engagement with story and storytelling.
So we're going to also give folks a chance to ask Elaine some questions. Elaine, tell us a little bit more about the poem. It sounds like you're using the poem at the beginning of your thesis to position yourself in the research, to share some of the things you shared with us at the beginning of the interview, of how, the story of how you came to do this research. Why poetry? And tell us a little bit about the process. Did you do some pre-writing before putting it into a poem? Did the first set of writing activities show themselves up in a poem? How did you move towards poetry? What was your process?
Sure. So a lot of questions I get about, my research, of course, because it is very specific and situated in relation to policing and the institution of police, is why are you interested in this? Or what motivated you to do research in this area? And I really, of course, am excited by that question. I want to share, but at the same time, it requires a return to very painful experiences. And so when my supervisor invited me to really, dance with how I might articulate those experiences in my dissertation, a dissertation that will then be available, to look up and explore, to read by the institution. I really thought about that. I really thought, Nisha mentioned ethics earlier, and the ethics of including a narrative that necessarily is a part of my narrative, but is also someone else's very, very personal and painful narrative. That is something I wrestle with always. And so poetry presented itself as the kind of space where I could talk about my pain, but also, still protect in some ways the storytelling that is for others, for them to tell their own story. And in terms of pre-writing, when it comes to poetry, I tend to just write almost just like how I'm feeling, like the draft of what it sounds like. It appears in my head, and then I write it, and then I refine it. It's almost like chisel, like what is the metaphor? You chisel clay or something. You just like chip away at it, and then it becomes more of what I'm hoping to express. But absolutely, what I love about the poetry as well is it's not an academic endeavor for me. It's not. I don't have or endeavor, I should say, like, I don't include citations. There are no footnotes. It's very, very much a creative expression of my academic work.
Wonderful. So it's time for questions for Elaine. And later on, when we move back to Nisha, we'll have you put a few of the folks you've been reading into the chat. But before we have you do that, raise your hand or wave at me. Do we have any questions for Elaine? And just like before, everything is interesting to us. And I know that Elaine will appreciate hearing the kinds of things that that you're thinking about as she speaks. Elaine, I'm going to give folks a little more time to think. I'm wondering if you are at a place in your research where you can share one or two findings with us. Are there things that you have seen, some patterns of how race and disability and difference play themselves out in policing? Are you there yet?
I wouldn't say I'm there yet. I would, however, say there's something I'm thinking of in terms of a potential finding. So again, my work is, I would probably say closer to like a narrative analysis of videos of again, deaf people in encounters with police. And, a theme that I've noticed watching these videos and restoring them, well, of course, as we know, they end violently. They end with, yes, with a lot of violence, with a lot of expectations from police demands put on the deaf, disabled, racialized subject. But what I'm noticing too in my restoring of these videos is this insurgence, this resistance from those in encounter with police, and disability in those situations. Deafness is almost that resistance. It's this resistance to spoken demands, to particular gestures that aren't welcome to the language spoken by the subjects that are being demanded to comply. And another theme that I'm noticing that I'm thinking I'm going to write a chapter on is this theme of laughter. In all three videos, there's laughter from the police officers right before they come to, or during and right before they come to arrest the deaf people in the videos, and I wonder, how then, what does laughter then mean in those situations? How does laughter then come to express a particular expectation of the institution of police, right? And in my blurb in the session description, I talk about the carceral expressions. How is laughter then a carceral expression? Laughing at disability, laughing at deafness, laughing at race. How is that an expression of the carceral state, of carceral logics? So yeah, no findings yet, but I'm thinking.
I think you have the beginning of two awesome chapters right there. Back to Nisha for a moment and have you, if you don't mind, put some of the writers that you've been working with. Nisha, we're back to you, and I want you to unmute if you don't mind, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about implications. Who ideally would you like to read about your work, whether it's the whole thesis itself or whether it's in articles or essays that you produce from your thesis, and what do you hope they would take away from all of the work you're doing?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because so often the question of audience can be really difficult, right? I've spent some time thinking about my audience, and I have come to the conclusion that my audience is definitely well-intentioned middle-class white people who want to go work for charities. And that's totally okay with me, because that's actually the environment that I was in when I worked in the charity sector. But I also hope that it can be a resource to groups on the ground, you know, organizations at the grassroots level, to be able to speak back to the power of NGOs. And I hope that some of the research around around the absenteeing of land in the discourse, in the INGO discourse, can be useful to people. So I guess in that way, like, I hope that it can be a resource for many different kinds of groups. But definitely it is a speaking back to the charity sector, which is a very large and powerful sector.
Great. Thank you so much. Ideally, how do you think you're going to share your research with your audiences? What are some of the things that you've begun to think about?
Yeah, so I have a two-part responsibility. One is I do need to publish my research that I did along the Thailand-Myanmar border in a way that's relevant and legible to my research participants. So that is work that I need to be taking on already, because I'm already working through analyzing the results from, I did 32 interviews there. And that work, you know, is not work that universities tend to support, right? Like, it's very hard to get funding for that kind of work. I think that part of the ethical problem with academics sharing their research is that we don't get financial support or even like academic support in making materials that our actual participants can use. Right. But that's one side of what I need to do. And then I'm going to try to write a book out of the dissertation. So that's scary, but anyway, that's a project.
So you have begun thinking, just like Elaine, about your findings. Do you have one or two themes that you could share with us now that, you know, will be present in the thesis and later on in the book and in the materials you develop for the communities that you've been working with?
Yeah, so I did a literature review of 8 of the biggest NGOs in the world, and to look through their annual reports for terms like land, community, local, terms having to do with conceptions of the human, because that's another stream that's going through my work, and also the concept land. Land does not show up. So it's really interesting, because while people are actually working on the problem of displacement in a massive way, like displacement has been a more and more large problem, and land is behind why people are getting displaced, and NGOs are coming in and trying to help people who've been displaced, the word land is very, very rare to be found in the annual reports of the biggest INGOs in the world. So that was one finding. And then, yeah, studying it on the ground as well. When I interviewed 32 people who work in the NGOs and grassroots community-based organizations, what I found was that community-based organizations are doing a lot of work around land confiscation and stopping land confiscation, but INGOs are not. And everybody agreed that land is extremely important to people, as in terms of a spiritual connection, and in terms of like socio-cultural, also political, and also material. Land is this massive piece of life for people, and yet INGOs, and these are INGOs that have been on the ground for like 25 years, have not been dealing with that issue.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to Elaine and ask about implications, but we're getting close to closing. And one of the things I always do in my classes in the last 10 minutes of our time together is ask people for takeaways. It's a gift to the guest speakers who have come to work with our community. It's a gift to each other, because often people will say something about what they're taking away, and the person sitting next to them will go, Yes, I didn't think about that, but when you mention it, that's what I'm taking away too. So as I'm going to ask Elaine about her audiences and who she wants to have read her work and the way she's going to share her research, I want folks to think a little bit about their takeaways, and we'll start putting them into the chat so I can read through them, and that will be our gift, our thank you to our guest speakers. So start thinking about your takeaways, and I'll let you know when it's time to type. But Elaine, who are you writing your dissertation to, and how are you going to share your research with them?
Sure. Yeah, as Nisha said, thinking about audience is always so tricky, how to think about who I'm writing my research to. I suppose, well, first, I guess in terms of, because of how I write my work, and that it's very much a creative expression of, again, my academic interests. I will say that I very much try to write in a way that hopefully reaches, people beyond, outside of academia, people within, communities and even perhaps hopefully classrooms that are outside of the university. I think of, one of our readings for the course I'm TAing, an Introduction to Disability Studies. One of the first readings was Jade Olmage's Introduction to Academic Ableism, and how, he discusses the university as the foremost, or as a foremost institution for ableism, and in talking about how we talk about our research, right? And I really very much try and hope to write my work in a way that is accessible, and by accessible, right, I mean in a way that it reaches and is able to come into contact with so many other ways of being in the world. So my audience is anyone and everyone who's interested in learning about disability and differently, learning and desiring disability differently, learning about stories of deafness and disability and race that don't that are other than those that are other than disability, deafness, and race as problems, right? So if you're interested in stories, if you're interested in poetry, if you're interested in dreaming of other ways of understanding disability as other than a problem, then I urge you I invite you into conversation with me in my work. And in terms of how I hope to share it, like Nisha, I hope to eventually, write a book about it. I'm currently on a book project with Tanya Tichkowski and a colleague of mine, Maddie Duells. So some of my poetry, I think, will hopefully find itself there. But as well, I hope to perform my work. Eventually, I've always been very much interested in spoken word. I've attended spoken word. I've never had the courage of actually being holding the mic, but if I could perform it in many ways as well, right? So ASL, if I could perform it those ways, just making it reachable, making it so that we can come into contact with what I hope to share. So yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, we have just a few more minutes. This is your moment. Would folks take a moment to, in the chat box, which if you haven't used it before, is at the bottom of the screen. Could folks just write one thing they're taking away from either Elaine or Nisha's interview today, one or both? I think it would be wonderful for us to take a look at what folks have heard today and what they are taking away. So please take a few minutes. We're interested in everything. And I'll start reading them out loud. So here we are, takeaways. And I want to sincerely thank Elaine and Nisha for their efforts to trying to change the inequality narratives in our society. Another takeaway, I am sad, worried, disappointed, and frustrated. And I am so glad Elaine and Nisha and those they work with are creating a research platform for these issues that can be hopefully addressed in the best way. Research as a response to disappointment and sadness and frustration and worry. And we have another takeaway about what Elaine said about using poetry to explore the story and the pain associated with the story for herself without taking space from others who share that same story. From my colleague Nestor, we have excellent conversation. Congratulations to Elaine and Nisha for the remarkable work, and thanks for organizing this. I am feeling so high right now. I think New Research at Noon is a big success, and you helped launch a nice, great new space. From Hannah, hi Hannah. Thanks for a wonderful session. I enjoyed the discussion today. My biggest takeaway is how much I've related to both projects. And Hannah is currently in Chandi Desai's Decolonizing Research course. And Hannah is focusing on a similar topic to Elaine's. So really appreciated your resources. And Hannah, thanks for telling us that. That was one of the outcomes we hoped to come out of putting, our TAs and postdocs, and doctoral fellows together with our undergrads. From Casey, they are expanding their perspective to think more about how to use research as a form of activism. And I'm so excited for new 270 next semester. So that's a call out to what's going to happen next semester. And one for Nisha, I think your project is really important and interesting. One takeaway I have is also a question. So Nisha will give you a moment to think about that too. I'm thinking about the idea of global citizenship and how it appears in the languages of international NGOs and how it's disconnected from land and occupation of land, and the idea of who can actually become a global citizen. So that's something we'll maybe have you think about. From Chantal, awesome conversation. Loved hearing about the creative aspect of Elaine's research, and it helped Chantal reimagine what the academy could be, what academic work is. And Chantal also liked the point that Nisha made about the importance of land to settlers without ever using the word land, and also a future student in the community engagement class. So I think we've created a little excitement there. And we have a thank you for the presentations. I love how you are including your own creative writing in your work. I am thinking about how you bring personal stories, how one could bring personal stories into their own work, in particular the listeners' work, and some appreciation for the scope of Elaine's work. Police and treating people with disabilities is not really talked about, and I love that more research is being done on it. I also really love it that Nisha was able to go to the country and do field work there. That must, it's not Nisha, it's Nisha, was able to go to the country and do field work there. That must have been an amazing experience, and that's something to talk about too. Both really interesting subjects from Katya. Casey's remark hit home because I did engage in international solidarity work abroad in the past. Also disability and the plantation are linked to my own research, so there were connections there. Thanks for the resources. So we only have 3 minutes. We did have one question, Nisha. Can you unmute and tell us something we can take away around global citizenship? And then I'm going to ask both Elaine and Nisha to share their takeaways. Go ahead, Nisha.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a thread that's going through my work, is around these designations that we have, and in terms of the hierarchies of humanity around who is citizen, who is refugee, who is migrant, who is expatriate, right? These terms that are used to actually construct belonging around who gets to be in places and who doesn't. And definitely the question of the absenting of land it's really interesting because it is tied to the modern nation states, right, after colonialism and how they've been formed. And so again, this kind of conquesting of land that is necessary, but then not really addressed. So it's something that I'm thinking about in my work too. And that point about land not being talked about, that's really, it's not me that made that point. I learned it from Dr. Eve Tuck, but also it's really like an important thread through a lot of Indigenous theory. So yeah.
Great, wonderful. I promised Nancy that I would end exactly at 1. And so Nisha and Elaine, thank you so much for starting us off. Elaine, one quick takeaway, and then one quick takeaway from Nisha.
Quick takeaway, oh, I mean, I learned so much, and quick takeaway is that I'm really interested, of course, in how citizenship, as Nisha has been saying, is taken up in law, and how the law stories characters, and characters like the alien, or like the refugee, or like the immigrant, or you know, in my work more relevantly, the deviant, the monstrous, the criminal, and yeah, I'm just so excited by kind of the threads that are have appeared today between Nisha and I's work, and to know that I have a fellow colleague in my department. So it was really lovely, really lovely.
Thank you. And Nisha, quick takeaway?
Yes, Elaine, it was wonderful to hear about your work too, and it was really inspiring. And my takeaway was thinking about how do we write about these institutions and try to make like changes inside of them while also abolishing them, because that's actually ultimately the project.
Wow, lots to think about. Thank you to everyone for joining us for New Research at Noon. Next month in November, same time, first Friday of the month from 12 to 1. I am still working on our guests for next week, but we will send out information as soon as I have confirmations. Thank you so much. Let's do some applause for Nisha and Elaine. It was really quite wonderful to hear about your work. And we are so happy that you are TAs here at New College. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye-bye.